My children came to take 800 acres of my land. Sign the papers or we'll abandon you, they said. But they forgot I do not break. When I finally took off my uniform for the last time, I felt older than 69. Not in my body so much, though the knees ached when it rained and my back carried the memory of too many nights in bunks not meant for comfort, but in the marrow of my spirit. 47 years in the service had a way of carving lines into a soul that no mirror could show. I had seen wars come and go, young men turn into old ones overnight, and too many flags folded into triangles. The day of retirement they shook my hand, gave me a plaque, and spoke words about honor and duty. All true, I suppose. But when the speeches ended and the hall emptied, it was just me in silence. No orders left to follow. No soldiers waiting for my word. Just silence. I drove straight back to Colorado. To the farm. To Tom. Only Tom wasn't waiting at the gate anymore. His grave was still fresh then, the soil darker than the rest of the pasture. The cedar cross I carved myself leaning slightly as if even it bowed under the weight of loss. My husband had fought his own battle. One the doctors named cancer, but I always thought of as a thief that slipped in at night and stole him piece by piece. I had buried him with my own hands still callous from work, standing in the same churchyard where we'd once said our vows. 51 years together. And yet I still caught myself turning to tell him things. The farm looked tired when I came back. The fences leaned, the barn roof had lost shingles, and the cedars we'd planted as saplings now stood tall and solemn, sentries keeping watch. Every stone in the wall we'd stacked together still bore the memory of our laughter and our arguments. I could point to a field and tell you how many blisters it had cost us. I could lean against the porch rail and hear Tom's hammer still echo in the grain. I remember the first morning alone there. I brewed coffee on the old percolator, the one with a dent from when Tom dropped it in '74. I took my mug out to the porch and watched the sun bleed over the Rockies. The air was thin, cold enough to make my breath curl, and the dew on the grass shimmered like silver threads. I told myself this is where I'll stay. No more moving, no more battles. Just the land and me. But retirement isn't as simple as that. When the military had ordered me, I went. When Tom had needed me, I stayed. Now, with both behind me, I found myself staring at long days that no one had mapped out. The quiet was a gift and a curse. I walked the fields slowly, checking the fences, greeting the cedars like old friends. I found Tom's gloves left on a fence post, stiff with weather, and I held them longer than I should have. At the barn, the hay still smelled faintly sweet though the mice had made free with it. I rubbed down the mare we'd bought our first year. Old now, her muzzle white, but she nudged me gently, reminding me that care doesn't retire. In town they treated me like something between a relic and a hero. "Ma'am," the young men said, tipping their hats. "Colonel," the old ones greeted, though I had set that title down. At the market, women asked how I managed alone. I smiled and said, "Same way you do, one day at a time." What I didn't tell them was that at night I sometimes laid Tom's jacket across my chest just to feel the weight of him again. The seasons turned. Summer scorched the fields golden. Autumn painted the cedars deep green against skies of fire. Winter buried the land in silence so thick I could hear my own heart. And through it all I worked. I mended what I could, let go of what I couldn't, and told myself that the children, our children, would carry on what Tom and I had built. It was a comforting thought. That's what farms are, after all, legacies you borrow for a while and then hand down. Every fence post was a lesson. Every harvest a story. I believed that when the time came, Michael and the others would step into the rhythm of the soil, feel the pull of the land in their bones the way Tom and I always had. I lived in that hope, tending to the farm as though keeping it alive was the same as keeping Tom alive. And in a way it was. When I dug in the garden, I could hear his laugh. When I hauled water from the creek, I felt his steady hand. The farm wasn't just land. It was memory made solid stone, cedar, soil, sky. I thought the battles were done, that I'd earned the quiet, that grief, though sharp, would eventually soften into the kind of ache that makes you smile as much as it makes you cry. But the truth, which I didn't yet know as I stood on that porch with my coffee, was that another war was waiting. Not against foreign enemies, not against illness, but against those I loved most. And oh, sweetheart, those are the hardest battles of all. It was a Sunday evening when they came. I'd made a roast earlier that day, potatoes, carrots, onions, the kind Tom used to like best. The smell still lingered in the kitchen, though the meat had long been carved and packed away. I'd half expected Michael to drop by for supper, maybe Sarah with her 2 girls or even Peter, though he usually kept to himself these days. I thought we'd sit around the table the way we used to, laughing, passing dishes, remembering Tom. But when the knock came at the door, it was not the knock of family arriving for comfort. It was short, sharp like a summons. Michael stood there, tall in his city coat, his face arranged in that gentle smile he uses when he wants something. Sarah and Peter trailed behind him. None of them carried food, flowers, or the lightness of a visit. Instead, Michael held a leather folder under his arm. "Mom," he began, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite him. "We've been talking about the future." That word, future, I should have braced myself. But I didn't. I offered them seats at the table, poured coffee into Tom's old mugs, tried to make it a family gathering. They didn't touch the coffee. They didn't even notice the roast still warming on the stove. Michael opened the folder and slid a stack of papers toward me. His voice was smooth, practiced. "We want to help you, Mom. Running this farm is too much for one person, especially at your age. We've put together a plan. A trust." I picked up the papers. 800 acres of our land, every pasture and cedar grove, transferred to a trust they would control. In return, I was guaranteed a small cottage at the edge of the property, for a peaceful old age. That's how the words read, as though my usefulness had expired, as though I was a weary animal to be penned up and watched. Then my eyes caught on one phrase. Habitation is possible only under the condition of proper psychological condition. I read it again. And again. My hands didn't shake, though I felt the blood drain from them. My own children, the ones I nursed, clothed, sent to school with lunches wrapped in wax paper, had written a clause questioning my sanity. They weren't offering me peace, they were plotting my erasure. I looked up at Michael. His eyes slid away, landing on the cedar beam above my head. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, while Peter crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "You've gone to a lot of trouble," I said finally, my voice even. "I suppose you've already decided I should sign?" "It's for your own good," Michael replied quickly, leaning in as though his urgency could cloak the cruelty. "We don't want you to worry about taxes, upkeep, all the work. This way you'll be comfortable. Safe." "Safe," I echoed softly. The word felt bitter on my tongue. I smiled then, a smile I'd learned in the military, the kind you wear when someone underestimates you. I folded the papers, slid them back into the folder, and pushed it toward him. "I'll think about it," I said. And then with deliberate calm, "But I won't be signing tonight." Sarah let out a breath, almost of relief, perhaps hoping the refusal was just another of Mother's stubborn moods. Michael's face tightened, but he didn't press. "Take your time," he said, though the edge in his voice betrayed his patience was already gone. They left soon after, the air between us colder than the November wind outside. I watched their car headlights disappear down the lane, and for the first time in years, I locked the door behind me. I thought I was alone then, but when I stepped back into the kitchen, I saw movement near the barn. It was Daniel, the young farmhand who came by twice a week to help mend fences and stack hay. He'd been sweeping out the barn and must have finished just as the children were leaving. He held his cap in his hands, looking awkward, like he'd stumbled upon a family quarrel he shouldn't have heard. "Ma'am," he said softly, I didn't mean to overhear, but I was right by the window when your boy was talking. I heard what they wanted you to sign." I felt my face flush, not with shame, but with a strange mix of fury and relief. Fury at the betrayal, relief that someone else knew. That I wasn't imagining it. Daniel's eyes were clear, steady. "It isn't right," he said. "A man works land his whole life, builds it with his wife, and then, well, it isn't theirs to take. Not that way." I nodded slowly. "You're right, son. But they think I'm too old to fight back." He shifted his weight, then looked at me with a kind of earnest loyalty I hadn't seen in years. "Then maybe they'll learn you're not." That night, I sat at Tom's old desk with the lamp burning low. The folder lay untouched beside me. I thought of my children's faces, of the coldness in Michael's tone, the silence of Sarah, the hardness of Peter. Family, I had always believed, was the rear guard, the ones who covered you when the world pressed too hard. But now I saw them differently. They were not my defenders. They were the siege. I poured myself a cup of coffee gone lukewarm and stared out the window at the cedars Tom and I had planted half a century ago. Their branches swayed in the wind, strong and unyielding. I whispered to him then, though he was long gone. "They think they can write me out, Tom. But they don't know me as well as they think. The battles aren't over yet." And with that I made a quiet vow. I would not sign. Not today. Not ever. The morning after that bitter Sunday, I woke with the kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. It was the same sensation I used to have before a mission. That sharpness in the chest, that quiet certainty that something had shifted and there was no going back. My children thought they could corner me with papers and polite words. They had no idea that I'd spent my life reading contracts, maps, and orders more complicated than anything they could cook up. I brewed a pot of strong coffee and set a pan of cornbread in the oven. I'd need strength. Then I walked to the back of the house, to the little office Tom and I had built in what used to be the mudroom. It smelled faintly of cedar and ink, though I hadn't spent much time there in years. In the corner sat the safe, iron heavy, with a combination only Tom and I had ever known. My fingers spun the dial slowly, muscle memory guiding me even through the tremble of age. The lock gave its familiar click, and when I swung the door open, the past came tumbling out. Folders, rolled maps, envelopes yellowed at the edges, all tucked neatly as though Tom himself had placed them there yesterday. I sat at the desk and began to lay them out. At first glance, they might have looked like nothing but dust and paper. But to me, each page was a blade. There were the cadastral maps, official land surveys marked with the old boundaries Tom and I had fought to preserve. I traced the lines with my finger, remembering the day we stood before the county board and argued against a developer who wanted to split the fields into housing lots. We won that day. The map was stamped with signatures and seals, proof that our acres had been protected under agricultural designation. That wasn't just ink, that was armor. Next came the contracts. Tom had always been careful, keeping receipts, deeds, and every letter from the bank. There was one from 1972, stating outright that the back pasture, nearly 200 acres of it, was on land flagged for environmental study due to a rare bird population. I remembered the men who came out with binoculars muttering about conservation. At the time it had felt like a nuisance. Now it gleamed like a shield. If part of the land was under protection, no trust could claim it without scrutiny. Deeper still, I found a brittle envelope with the county seal. Inside was a letter archival confirmation that some of our property was listed in a state register of ecologically sensitive lands. I read it twice, my heart thudding like a drum. My children may have thought me just an old woman, stubborn and sentimental, but here was proof the land itself had value beyond their schemes. I stacked the papers neatly, soldiering them into order the way I once lined up men for inspection. This was not nostalgia anymore. This was ammunition. As I worked, I caught sight of Tom's handwriting in the margins of one map. "Never sell," he'd written in his rough script. underlining the words twice. My throat tightened. He had known even then that the temptation might come one day from developers, neighbors, even family. He had left me a command simple and fierce. Never sell. I closed my eyes and let myself hear his voice steady and warm. Stand your ground, Annie. Don't give an inch you don't mean to give. By afternoon, the desk was covered in piles. I labeled them with slips of paper, maps, contracts, environmental documents, bank letters. I sharpened a pencil, made notes, cross-referenced years. It felt like briefing for battle again. The weight of grief that had bent my shoulders since Tom's passing seemed to lift, replaced by something harder, steadier. Outside, Daniel was working in the barn. I saw him pause at the door, glancing in at the spread of papers. He didn't step in, just tipped his cap and gave a nod, the kind a soldier gives another before a fight. I nodded back. That night, I left the safe open for the first time in years. I wanted those papers near me, wanted to hear their whisper in the dark. They reminded me I wasn't helpless. Lying in bed, I thought of my children again. I wondered if they had practiced their little ambush, rehearsed the gentle tones, the forced patience. I imagined them congratulating each other afterward, certain that mother would fold soon enough. Perhaps they'd even penciled in a date on the calendar for signing. I almost laughed. They had forgotten who raised them, who stitched uniforms, balanced books, fought banks and floods and droughts, who kept this farm alive through winters so harsh the cattle's breath froze in the air. They thought they could bury me under paper, but I knew the power of paper better than they did. By the time dawn crept through the window, my plan was already taking shape. The maps and letters would be my shield. The contracts and receipts my spear. If they wanted to wage war in courts and offices instead of fields, then so be it. I was ready. I stood at the porch looking out over the cedars Tom and I had planted half a century ago. Their branches swayed as if in agreement. The wind carried the scent of earth, cold and strong. They wanted to test my condition. I murmured aloud, my breath fogging in the morning air. Well, they're about to see just how clear my mind can be. I tightened my shawl, squared my shoulders, and stepped back inside. There would be no surrender. Not here. Not ever. I've never believed in going into a fight without backup. The military taught me that, but truth be told, Tom taught it even earlier. He used to say, Annie, even a plow horse needs a partner to pull a heavy load. That Sunday night when the children left, their folders still burning on my table, I knew this was going to be one of those heavy loads. The papers I'd found in the safe gave me ammunition, yes, but a weapon is no good unless you know how to wield it. I could read maps, cross-reference contracts, and smell deceit in a clause a mile away, but courts and trusts had their own battlefield, one I hadn't marched across in years. So the next morning, I picked up the phone and called Harold Bennett. Harold was a name most folks in these parts still spoke with respect, though he'd been retired nearly a decade. Back in the 70s, he was the lawyer every farmer turned to when developers came sniffing around, promising riches in exchange for soil and sweat. He was tall, rail-thin, with a voice like gravel and a heart that beat for the land. Harold was the kind of man who didn't mind getting mud on his shoes walking a pasture line with you, just to be sure the papers matched the earth. The phone rang 3 times before a woman answered. Bennett residence. Marjorie, it's Annie Walker, I said, trying to keep my tone even. Oh, Annie. Her voice brightened. It's been ages. Harold's out in the garden. I'll fetch him. Moments later, his familiar rasp came on the line. Annie? Thought you'd forgotten about old men like me. Not a chance, I said. Harold, I need your help. It's about the farm. There was a pause, the kind that meant he was listening closer than most folks ever would. What about the farm? My children are trying to take it, I said simply. He didn't gasp or fuss, just gave a long sigh, as though he'd seen this story too many times before. Tell me everything. So I did. About the trust, the clause questioning my sanity, the folder on the table. About the maps and contracts I dug out of the safe. His voice stayed steady, but when I finished, he said in that gravelly tone, "You did right to call me. We're not letting them bulldoze you with paperwork. Bring those documents by tomorrow. I'll dust off my briefcase." That was my first ally. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. The law moves slowly, and sometimes justice needs a little fire to light its way. That's where the second ally came in. Her name was Lucy Ramirez, and she wrote for the Colorado Sentinel. Most folks remembered her for the exposé she did on a mining company dumping waste in the river. She was young then, barely 30, with a pen sharper than any sword. Developers hated her, politicians feared her, and the townsfolk trusted her because she never printed what she couldn't prove. I'd met Lucy years back when she interviewed Tom and me about sustainable farming. She'd sat at our kitchen table, eaten my cornbread, and asked questions no other reporter had bothered with. When the article came out, she didn't just praise us. She told the truth about what it meant to keep a farm alive against the odds. I still had her number, scribbled on an old notepad. My hand shook a little dialing it, but her voice was the same when she answered. "Lucy Ramirez. Lucy, this is Annie Walker. Don't know if you remember me." "Of course I do," she interrupted. "You and Tom out on the Colorado farm. I can still taste that cornbread." That made me smile, though it faded quickly. "Lucy, I've got a story you might want to hear. Only this time, it's not about saving a farm from drought or banks. It's about saving it from my own children." There was a long silence. Then she said softly, "Tell me." I laid it out again, the trust, the cruel clause, the proof in my safe. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The truth itself was sharp enough. When I finished, Lucy whistled low. "Annie, that's more than a family spat. That's a fight for legacy. And I'll be damned if I let them paint you as some frail old woman. You're the kind of story people need to hear, about grit, about standing your ground." "Will you write it?" I asked. "Not just write it," she said firmly. "We'll publish it front page. But first I'll come by, see the documents myself. I don't print smoke without fire." That was my second ally. That evening, as I sat on the porch, the cedars swaying above me, I felt something shift. For the first time since Tom's passing, I didn't feel alone. I had Harold with his old bones and sharp mind. I had Lucy with her pen and her fire. And I had Daniel, though young, watching my back in ways my own children no longer would. I sipped my coffee, the night settling cool around me, and I whispered into the dark, "Tom, I'm not walking this road by myself. They want a war? Well, they're going to get one." And deep in my bones I knew I was ready. War begins quietly. Not with a trumpet or a banner, but with the steady scratch of a pen and the resolve of a woman who refuses to bow. Harold came by 2 days later. His tall frame hunched a little more than I remembered. His hair thin and silver, but his eyes still sharp as a hawk's. He spread my documents across the kitchen table like a general studying a battlefield. "These here," he muttered, tapping the cadastral maps, "will hold up in court. Agricultural designation is a shield, and it can't be undone by wishful children. And this," he lifted the state letter about environmental protections, "this is dynamite. Judges don't like trusts meddling in conservation land. We'll file an injunction first thing." He wrote down steps in his neat, blocky script: prevent transfer, secure conservation documents, file temporary restraining order. I felt a flicker of the old strength then, the kind I used to carry in the service when a plan started to take shape. My children thought they could outflank me. They hadn't counted on Harold. That very week, he filed a legal block at the county courthouse, barring any transfer of my land until its status could be reviewed. It was only a first move, but it drew a line in the sand. For the first time, the ground under my feet felt solid again. While Harold worked the courts, Lucy brought the fire. She drove up in her little blue car, notebook in hand, camera slung over her shoulder. "I don't want to just tell your story, Annie," she said as we walked the fields together. "I want people to see you, to see what you've built, what you're protecting." She asked questions about Tom, about the years we spent raising cattle and children, about how we planted those cedar trees when we were too young to know what the years would demand of us. She asked about the children's plan, about the clause that questioned my sanity. When I showed her the papers, her face hardened. "This isn't just greedy. This is cruel," she said, snapping a photograph of the clause. "Don't worry, Annie. I'll make sure the truth shines through." By the following week, the Colorado Sentinel ran her article on the front page. Veteran widow battles to save family farm from her own children. There I was in black and white, standing beside the cedars Tom and I had planted. Not a victim but a fighter. Lucy described the land, the conservation protections, and my refusal to bow to pressure. She wrote about dignity, about legacy, about the quiet war being waged in our little corner of Colorado. The phone rang off the hook that day. Neighbors called, some offering pie, others offering to stand by my side. An old sergeant I hadn't heard from in 20 years sent a letter that simply read, "Hold the line, Colonel. Proud of you." It wasn't just support. It was recognition. They didn't see me as a frail widow anymore. They saw me as what I was. A woman standing guard over something bigger than herself. The children, of course, didn't take kindly to any of it. Michael showed up at dusk one evening, his face red as the setting sun. "Mom, what on earth have you done?" he demanded, waving a copy of the newspaper. "Do you know how humiliating this is for us? You've dragged our family's name through the mud." I stood steady on the porch, my hands folded before me. "No, Michael," I said quietly. "I've told the truth. If the truth dirties your name, that's not my doing." He spluttered, then tried to soften. "We just want what's best for you. You're making this harder than it needs to be." I thought of the clause, those cold words about my psychological condition. I looked him in the eye, and for the first time since he was a boy, I saw not my son but a stranger wearing his face. "What's best for me," I said firmly, "is to protect what your father and I built. And that's exactly what I intend to do." He left without another word, the tires of his car spitting gravel down the lane. That night I sat by the window, listening to the wind moving through the cedars. I wasn't naive. This was only the beginning. They would not give up easily. But neither would I. Harold had given me the shield of the law. Lucy had given me the power of the people. And in my heart I carried Tom's voice, steady and strong. Never sell. Never surrender. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, my papers stacked neatly at my bedside like loyal soldiers keeping watch. The first counterattack had been launched. The war was on. When Lucy's article hit the paper, I thought it might stir some chatter in town, maybe a few kind nods at the feed store. I never expected the wave that followed. The first sign came the very next morning. I opened my front door and found a pie on the porch, apple with a note tucked under the crust. "We're with you, Annie. The Millers." That afternoon another knock came at the door. Old Ruthie Henderson stood there with a jar of peach preserves and tears in her eyes. "My son tried to sell off our land years back," she whispered. "I didn't have the fight in me then. But you give me hope." By the end of the week, I couldn't walk into town without someone stopping me. Farmers, clerks, even teenagers who had read the story online. They didn't see me as some fragile widow anymore. They saw me as a woman holding the line, not just for myself, but for all of us who had ever been pushed aside, underestimated, or written out. At the post office, I was handed a stack of letters so thick it made my hands shake. Some came from neighbors, others from strangers miles away. Veterans wrote from across the state, men and women I'd never met but who knew what it meant to fight for ground that mattered. One letter read, "Colonel, you may be retired, but your campaign is the kind that still inspires us to stand straighter. Hold your ground. We've got your six." I cried over that one. Right at the kitchen table with the envelope spread before me. Not the weak kind of crying, but the kind that feels like strength breaking through your ribs. The local radio station picked up the story next. They invited me to speak one morning, their host cheerful and kind. "Mrs. Walker, folks are saying you've become the voice of every farmer who ever had to defend what was theirs. How does that feel?" I told him the truth. It feels heavy, but it feels right. This land isn't just acres on paper. It's where my husband and I built a life. It's where my children took their first steps. And it's not mine alone. It belongs to memory, to community, and to every cedar that still stands watch. The phones lit up after that interview. People called in with their own stories, about greedy relatives, about corporations, about the quiet battles no one ever saw. My story had become a mirror for theirs. And that, sweetheart, is when I knew the tide had turned. Because the children heard it too. Michael stopped coming by in person. Instead, I received curt phone calls, his voice tight, controlled. "Mom, this has gone too far. Do you realize the damage you're doing to the family name?" "The family name," I told him, "isn't made of newspaper ink. It's made of the choices we stand by. And I intend to stand by mine." Sarah wrote a letter of her own. Not the warm kind with a daughter's hand, but one typed, formal, cold. She pleaded with me to consider the long-term harmony of the family, and to end this public spectacle. I folded it neatly and placed it in the same stack as the veteran's letters, where its hollow words rattled like a pebble among stones. Peter stayed silent. But silence can be louder than words. Meanwhile, neighbors began stopping by to offer help. Daniel, the young farmhand, built a new fence line with 3 other men from down the road, hammering posts while whistling old work songs. Women from the church came with casseroles and prayers. Even the high schoolers showed up one Saturday, eager to stack hay and clean the barn as a show of solidarity. Every act, every pie, every letter was another stone in the wall of defense rising around me. My children had thought to corner me with legal tricks and whispers about my mind. Instead, they found themselves staring at a fortress built not of bricks, but of people. One evening, as the sun sank low and the cedars cast long shadows across the porch, I sat with Lucy. She had come to check on me, to gather updates for her follow-up piece. "You know, Annie," she said, flipping her notebook closed, "sometimes one story opens the door for 100 others. You've given folks permission to speak. You've made it clear they don't have to bow their heads and take whatever's handed to them." I looked out at the land, the barn glowing gold in the last light. I didn't set out to be anybody's example. I just wanted to protect what Tom and I built. "And that," she said softly, "is exactly why people trust you." The wind rustled through the cedars then, a low whisper like an amen. That night I realized something I hadn't dared to believe before. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It had become something larger, something shared. I wasn't just defending my farm. I was carrying the stories of countless others who had lost their ground, their dignity, or their say. And oh, how the children must have hated that. Because for every rumor they spread, for every whisper of doubt they tried to plant, there were 100 voices rising to drown them out. Public opinion had turned, and it had turned firmly in my favor. Victories have a way of drawing fire. When the town rallied around me, when the veterans' letters piled higher than bills, I knew my children wouldn't take it lying down. They had grown used to thinking themselves clever, to believing I was too old, too soft to resist them. Now that their scheme had been dragged into the light, they began to claw back in the shadows. The first strike came in whispers. At the feed store, I overheard 2 men muttering near the sacks of grain. "Shame about Annie," one said, shaking his head. "Hurt her mind slipping. Kids just trying to keep her safe." The other nodded gravely. "Sad business. Can't farm forever." I stood just an aisle away, my hands wrapped around a basket of seed. For a moment I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. But then I reminded myself rumors are smoke and I had fire of my own. That week, Lucy published her second article. She quoted my documents, printed copies of the conservation letters, and laid out the facts in black and white. She even interviewed Daniel, who told the story of overhearing the children's cruel proposal. Suddenly, those whispers shriveled into nothing. Truth cuts cleaner than gossip ever can. When rumors failed, they tried pressure. One morning, I opened my mailbox to find a thick envelope stamped Internal Revenue Service. My heart stuttered. I sat on the porch steps, tearing it open with stiff fingers, only to find notice of a pending audit on my farm accounts. Harold was already at the house when I waved the papers at him. He read them twice, then chuckled low in his chest. "They tipped their hand," he said. "This isn't the IRS, it's a scare tactic. Look here. The letterhead's wrong. Sloppy forgery." He marched me right down to the county clerk's office and filed a complaint. Within a week, the so-called audit evaporated like fog in the sun. But the sting of it remained. My children had tried to make me cower under threats of the law. They had forgotten I knew how to stand under heavier fire. When intimidation didn't work, they turned to isolation. Neighbors who once brought casseroles began receiving polite calls, Michael telling them not to meddle, that family matters should stay within the family. Sarah spread tales that I was too fragile for visitors, too unstable for conversation. But people had seen me with their own eyes. They'd shaken my hand, watched me walk my fields, heard my voice steady on the radio. The children's stories didn't match the woman they knew. And so, instead of pulling away, the community drew closer. More pies showed up on the porch. More hands offered to mend fences. More letters came by mail, some from as far as Texas and Montana. My children wanted to silence me, but instead they amplified my voice. The final strike came from within. Late one evening, Sarah herself showed up at the farm. Her car headlights swept across the cedars, her silhouette stiff as she climbed the porch steps. "Mom," she began, her voice tight. "Can we talk?" I gestured to the rocker opposite mine. She sat, smoothing her skirt, her eyes avoiding mine. "We never wanted it to come to this," she said. "The articles, the letters, the gossip. It's tearing us apart. Why can't you just sign the papers and let us handle things? We're only trying to protect you." "Protect me?" I asked softly. "By declaring me insane? By stealing the land your father and I bled for?" Her face tightened, but she didn't deny it. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Sarah, when you were little, you used to run barefoot through these fields. Do you remember? You called the cedars your soldier trees. Your father and I planted them so you would always have something to stand taller than you. Now you want to cut me down under their shade." She looked at me then, and for the briefest flicker I saw shame. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She rose, smoothed her skirt again, and said, "This isn't over, Mom." "No," I replied, my voice steady. "It isn't. But you should know, it won't end the way you think." When her car disappeared into the night, I sat listening to the wind through the cedars. Every attack they had launched, rumors, forgeries, isolation, had been repelled. Each attempt had only strengthened my resolve and sharpened my allies. The children were fighting like amateurs, swinging blindly. I was fighting like a soldier with discipline, patience, and evidence. And one thing was becoming clear. Their war was already lost. Victory doesn't arrive with a bang. Sometimes it comes as a whisper in the courthouse, or as a pen scratching across parchment. Mine came slowly, like dawn easing over the horizon, until one morning I realized the darkness had given way to light. Harold had been working day and night, his long fingers ink-stained from drafting motions. He stood before the county board, documents in hand, his voice firm as granite. "This land isn't just acreage," he declared. "It's protected ground, both by environmental law and by the blood and sweat of the people who tended it. To strip this woman of her rights would be to strip this county of its own soul. The board listened. The evidence was too strong to ignore. The injunction held, and any attempt by my children to transfer the land was struck down. For the first time since they slid that cruel folder across my table, I felt the weight lift from my chest. But I didn't stop there. Defense alone wouldn't do. I wanted something stronger, something permanent. If my children could scheme once, they could scheme again. I needed to make sure that when my hands could no longer hold the soil, the land would remain untouchable. That's when I signed the conservation agreement. It was a brisk autumn morning when Harold and I met with the representatives from the state. I sat at the long oak table, the maps and contracts spread out before me like an old battle plan. The officials explained the terms. My farm would be designated a reserve, its fields and cedars protected from development or sale. Forever. No loophole, no clause, no trust could undo it. As I picked up the pen, I thought of Tom. I could almost feel his hand on mine, steady and warm, guiding me. Never sell, his voice whispered, and I smiled through the sting in my eyes. With one signature, I sealed not only my victory but the land's future. When the papers were signed, Harold leaned back with a rare smile. "Well, Annie," he said, "you've done it. They can huff and puff all they want, but this house isn't coming down." I laughed. A real full laugh I hadn't heard from myself in months. It felt like the farm itself was laughing with me, the cedars rustling their approval in the wind. But victory to me wasn't just about winning. It was about giving back. I thought of the women I'd met over the years, widows raising children alone, mothers working dawn to dusk just to keep a roof overhead. I remembered the nights when Tom and I nearly lost the farm, when a kind neighbor's help had made all the difference. So I started a fund. It was small at first, just a portion of my savings and the modest pension I'd put aside. But with Lucy's help, word spread. Donations trickled in from across the state. $10 here, $50 there, sometimes even a check for $1,000 from someone who'd read my story and wanted to help. I named it the Cedar Fund, after the trees that had stood guard over our lives. Its mission was simple: to help single mothers who farm, to give them seed money, legal aid, and a hand when no one else offered one. The first grant went to a young woman named Carla, just 26, with 2 toddlers and a flock of chickens. She'd been on the brink of losing her land. With the fund's help, she bought feed, repaired her barn roof, and kept her place alive. When she came to thank me, tears in her eyes, I shook my head. "No need to thank me, dear," I said, placing a hand on hers. "Just promise me you'll pass it on when you can. That's how legacies live." Word of the conservation agreement and the fund spread quickly. The same neighbors who had once brought pies now came with congratulations. The veterans wrote again, calling it a campaign one. Even strangers sent notes, thanking me for showing that resistance was possible, that dignity could be preserved. And the children, they vanished from the battlefield. No more papers, no more visits. I heard through the grapevine that Michael was furious, that Sarah wept behind closed doors, that Peter avoided the subject altogether. But their silence was no longer a threat. It was surrender. One evening I walked the fields as the sun dipped low. The sky painted with streaks of rose and gold. The cedars swayed, tall and unyielding, their roots deep in the soil Tom and I had once turned with our bare hands. I thought of the generations to come, the children who would climb these trees, the mothers who would sow these fields. I had not just defended the farm. I had secured its future. And as I stood there, the wind curling through my hair, I whispered into the dusk, "We won, Tom. We really won." Victory tasted bittersweet. The land was safe, the cedars protected, and the Cedar Fund was already putting down roots of its own. But in the quiet of the evenings, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the fields, a heavier truth settled over me. I could no longer pretend my children were my rear guard. They were not the ones covering me in battle. They had become the enemy line. That realization carried me into the lawyer's office one gray morning. Harold sat across from me, his spectacles perched low on his nose, papers spread before him. "You're certain, Annie?" he asked gently, though his eyes told me he already knew the answer. I nodded. "They've shown me who they are. And I won't leave the farm or my legacy in hands that would strip it bare." He slid a new document across the table. My revised will. The farm, already under conservation, would remain a reserve. The Cedar Fund would be endowed further with what little else I had saved. And my children, Michael, Sarah, Peter, would be written out entirely. It's a strange thing, signing a paper that severs the bond you once thought unbreakable. I remembered the nights rocking them to sleep, the scraped knees I patched, the stories told by lamplight. I remembered birthdays, graduations, weddings, all the moments when I thought love was enough to tether us forever. But love without respect is a rope that frays. They had cut it themselves when they slid that cruel folder across my table. My hand didn't shake as I signed. When it was done, Harold reached across and placed his weathered hand over mine. "You've chosen a legacy, Annie. Not everyone has the courage to do that." Driving home, I thought about that word, legacy. It no longer meant children carrying on the work. It meant choosing what would outlive me with purpose, rather than chance. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the cedars. I whispered to Tom, "I always thought we were building this for them, but maybe we were building it for something larger all along." The next week, Michael called. His voice was clipped, impatient. "Mom, we need to talk. There are still matters of inheritance." "There are no matters left," I interrupted, my voice steady. "I've seen to it. The land is preserved. The farm is no longer yours to scheme over." A pause. Then a sharp inhale. "You'd cut out your own children?" "I didn't cut you out," I said quietly. "You stepped out the moment you chose greed over family. I simply closed the door behind you." He hung up without another word. Sarah wrote once more. A letter thick with anger and sorrow, calling me cruel, saying I had destroyed the family. I tucked it into a drawer and left it unopened. Peter never spoke a word, though neighbors said he looked hollow in town, avoiding every mention of my name. I did not celebrate their absence, but I did not mourn it either. Grief had already come and gone the night I realized family could be the ones holding the knife. This now was resolve. With the will signed and the children excluded, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in months, I could walk the fields without glancing over my shoulder for betrayal. I could stand in the barn and hear only the echoes of Tom's laughter, not the ghosts of schemes. The farm, the cedars, the very soil. They were no longer bargaining chips in someone else's game. They were mine, and soon they would belong to the future I had chosen. I closed the door on betrayal that week. Not gently, not with hesitation, but firmly, with the sound of a lock clicking into place. And when I sat on the porch that night, the wind whispering through the cedars, I knew no signature, no betrayal would ever erase me again. Evenings are my favorite now. I sit on the porch with a quilt over my knees, the cedars whispering above me, the Rockies painted gold by the setting sun. The farm is quieter than it used to be, but it breathes steady, like an old friend who's earned its rest. I think often of Tom. Sometimes I catch myself speaking aloud to him, pointing out the mare grazing by the fence line or the way the wind bends the tall grass. If he hears me, I imagine he smiles. We built this place together, every stone and cedar stitched with our sweat and laughter. And though he's gone, the land remembers him. I do too. The children, they've drifted like strangers down a road I no longer travel. Their absence still aches, but it no longer defines me. I gave them the best years of my love, but I will not let their betrayal be the closing chapter of my story. Instead, my legacy lies in the soil itself, in the conservation papers sealed tight, in the cedar fund that will help young mothers plant roots of their own, in the veterans who write me letters still, calling me comrade, reminding me that battles can be fought at any age. When the wind rushes through the cedars, I hear not sorrow but triumph. I have preserved the land, my dignity, and a story that will outlive me. No signature can erase that. And when my time comes, I hope someone will sit on this porch, hear the trees swaying, and know, here lived a woman who stood her ground. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.